Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of a suitable agency to a new session of suitable conversations at Sunder Nursery. This series of conversations was first inspired by our love for all things books, and a suitable agency is extremely grateful to everyone at Sunder Nursery for their continued support in making these conversations possible. And now for the event we've been waiting for. History, Gender and Power. Writing the Medieval Past with two very special speakers, Anirudh Kanisetti and Parvati Sharma. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Anirudh for joining us despite a painful foot injury. Anirudh Kanisetti is the author of Lords of the Deccan, Southern India from Chalukyas to Cholas, and Lords of Earth and Sea, A History of the Chola Empire. He writes the Thinking Medieval column for ThePrint and hosts two podcasts, Echoes of India and YUDDHA, the Indian Military History podcast. He has won the Sahitya Akademi Yuva Puraskar, the Ramnath Goenka Sahitya Samman, the Tata Literature Lives Non-Fiction Book of the Year Award, featured in PEN America's India at 75 list. Anirudh has also is also an Open Mind of 2022 and on the New India Express 40 under 40 list. Anirudh was formerly editor at the MAP Academy, where he worked on the Encyclopedia of Indian Art. Prior to this, he was Associate Fellow at Takshashila Institution. His work has received many grants from Princeton University, MAP Academy, and India Foundation for the Arts. Parvati Sharma has written two historical biographies, Jahangir, an intimate portrait of the great Mughal and Akbar of Hindustan. She has also written two books of history for children, The Story of Babur and Rattu and Puri's Adventures in History, 1857. Her debut was a collection of short stories called The Dead Camel and Other Stories of Love, followed by a novella, Close to Home. Parvati lives in New Delhi, where she has studied English literature and Indian history and worked as a travel writer, editor, and journalist. Thank you both for being a part of Suitable Conversations. And
hello. Well, thank you very much for having us, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you, Anirudh. Today, I think the last time we shared a stage was about 4 years ago when Akbar we were talking about Akbar, and it's very nice to be here today talking about the Cholas. And in many ways, I was thinking just this morning, this is a very suitable conversation because between in these troubled times, somebody who has written about the Mughals, who are now dynasty non grata in our current republic, and if there is a dynasty to replace them in the sort of new decolonized history that we are writing, then the Cholas are usually the first name on that list. So I'm looking forward to this conversation with you, Anirudh.
Likewise. Thank you for agreeing to do this once again, Parvati. Thank you to the Suitable Agency for having me, and thank you to all of you for joining us on this lovely evening. All the two-legged people and the four-legged gentleman back there in the audience. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation.
So they've given us three very big subjects to talk about: history, gender, and power. And I have sort of three broad questions about these three sort of pillars. So let's see how the conversation goes. Let me ask you the first one. We can begin with the history.
Sure.
You know, I don't know how you feel when you are writing, but broadly, I think history can be done in several sort of three broad ways. You know, there is the sort of fact, so-called, of history, what actually happened, right? Like looking to determine chronologies and events. And then there is the history, the method of history, which is the sort of weighing of evidence and weighing of sources and seeing why something may have happened the way it happened and, you know, how. And then finally there are the sort of the emotions that are associated with history writing, you know, because no matter how dispassionate we might like to be as writers of history, it's very difficult not to have feelings about our subjects. And these are things that, you know, I mean, maybe 10 years ago, this might have been something, these might have been fairly abstract classifications, but if you look, and you know, unfortunately, I think for us, we are living in tragically historical times. History is happening all around us, all the time, far too much of it. And you can see it playing out, you know, you can see the, you know, the trouble that you might have figuring out, what is going on in this, you know, this horrible assault on Iran just now, the genocide in Gaza that's been going on for the past 2 years. You will be, you know, you're constantly being asked to sift and weigh evidence and interpretation of what is going on. And most importantly, it is, you know, it is almost incumbent on you, and it should be, to take a position on, you know, what you are seeing and how you are seeing it. And when in your book on the Cholas, which thanks to this conversation I had the pleasure of reading recently, I see that, you know, you are grappling with all of these things in fairly unique ways, because you have a very particular set of sources which compel you towards a particular kind of interpretation and analysis. It might be different, say, if you had textual sources, you have, you know, a different kind of source. And as a writer, you are not shy of having opinions, you know, so you are, and I'm glad for it that you have, you know, you take not necessarily, you know, blatant, but you take positions, which is a good thing. How do you reconcile this in your history writing, these three things: your sources, your interpretation, and then your own feelings about your subjects?
That's a fabulous question, really, Parvati. To begin with, let's deal with the ostensibly the easiest aspect of it, which is sources. How do you write a history of a dynasty that rose and fell 1,000 years ago? Luckily for us, I think, the Cholas have left for us an enormous body of inscriptions, primarily on temple walls, by far the most comprehensive inscriptional record we have of any pre-modern Indian dynasty, numbering almost 13,000, of which about 6,000 have been comprehensively edited, translated, published, etc., etc. Now, over the decades, the way that these primary sources have been dealt with has varied quite drastically, right? If you look at the first scholarly discovery of the Cholas in the 1930s by the great Professor Nilakanta Shastri, Professor Shastri was writing at a time when it was pretty clear that the British Raj was on its last legs. And Indian politicians, diplomats, intellectuals alike were searching for examples of what an India, or a quote-unquote pure, untouched Hindu India looked like. And I think especially since they were living in a time where global empire was being questioned, they wanted to have examples of Indian empires that appeared to be at least more benevolent. And the Cholas really lend themselves to this kind of interpretation, because not only do you have monumental temples like the Brihadishwara temple in Tanjavur, you have all these inscriptions written by the Cholas where they are waxing eloquent about how great they are as rulers, how much prosperity they have brought to the land, etc., etc., etc. And in the decades after independence, as post-colonial thought began to develop, historians began to interrogate these primary sources with more specific questions in mind. So rather than how great were the Cholas really, they were trying to figure out stuff like, what was the nature of the Chola state? How did the Cholas compose inscriptions? What was the technicality of the language they used in their inscriptions? What was the nature of international trade like under the Cholas? So very, very specialized research questions. And especially in the last couple of years, we've seen a very different set of methods applied to these same primary sources, eerily reminiscent of what was happening in the 1930s, in that this uncritical reception of Chola inscriptions, of how great they claim to be, of their overseas conquests, I think have fed very well into, I think, this deep anxiety and insecurity that seems to drive right-wing politics, in that, how dare you say the Mughals were conquerors? We'll have you know that the Hindus were great conquerors too. I mean, that's the essence of it. Pardon me, pardon my French. Now, I find this very interesting because the idea of the Cholas as conquerors relies entirely on the Cholas themselves, right? And as we all know, politicians are very reliable narrators of their own achievements, right? Right? I see a bunch of faces nodding and smiling. But this brings me finally to my approach, which is that I think that we are not giving medieval people their due when we blindly say that, oh, the Sultan decreed this, therefore it must have been true. We have to, I think it's important for us, especially as citizens of a democracy, to understand that power has an amazing ability to be many things to many different people, to present itself in many ways to many audiences. And the Cholas especially, I think, were masters of this. When a Chola king issues an inscription saying that I conquered these lands, rather than take it as a objective statement of historical fact which the king issued so that generations 1,000 years later would worship the very ground that he walked on, we have to ask ourselves, why did the king say this? Why did he choose to say it in this year, in this place? And the fact is that the Cholas are really the only early medieval dynasty for which we can successfully both ask and answer this question, because they've left behind so many inscriptions, right? One of the things I really enjoyed doing in Lords of Earth and Sea was tracing out the careers of individual diplomats, generals, queens aligned with the Chola court. And by mapping out their activities, you can get a sense, I think, of political minds, and astonishingly intelligent political minds. The way they choose to present themselves, off the top of my head, I'm thinking of the Chola queen Sembian Mahadevi, right? So Sembian Mahadevi, very important. In fact, I've argued that much more than the great conqueror Rajaraja I, Sembian Mahadevi is the true founder of the empire. And the reason why I think this is because Sembian Mahadevi uses temples essentially as nodes for political broadcasting. I see a few skeptical faces in the audience, so let me just elaborate what I mean by that. Temples very often are thought of as purely religious spaces. I think especially in contemporary politics, that's how they've been presented. But when you look at Chola inscriptions, you see that year after year, not only do particular figures in the Chola court make temple gifts, but they also preface them with a list of their achievements. And Sembian Mahadevi is really the sole Chola queen that really begins and kicks off this pattern. Because, just for a little bit of context, Sembian Mahadevi is active in the late 10th century. Up till that point, the Cholas were a fairly minor regional kingdom, right? And up till the lifetime of Sembian, all Chola queens only ever built a single temple over the course of their lifetimes, to which they would make endowments over the course of their careers. Sembian Mahadevi, in contrast, built 12 temples over the course of a roughly 30-40 year career. And each temple was carefully chosen to be in a site that was already a pre-existing pilgrimage site or a pre-existing market center. And when she made her gifts, she would have these absolutely fabulous eulogies to how holy and devout she was. So, once again, paraphrasing one of her inscriptions, "Hail prosperity! This glorious temple to the glorious god Shiva was built by the glorious queen Sembian Mahadevi, who was the wife of the late glorious king Gandaraditya and the mother of the holy and devoted king Uttama Chola. While building this glorious temple, the glorious queen Sembian Mahadevi built a glorious King Gandaraditya flower garden." How appropriate to be talking about this in Sunder Nursery. "Built a glorious King Gandaraditya flower garden and appointed the glorious local official XYZ to look after her temple grant." Now, It's very possible to read this, of course, as the work purely of a devout queen who's sitting about in the court and only emerging to do pious activities, right? But it's equally possible, and I'm not the first scholar to argue this, by the way. Many scholars before me have argued this. It's equally possible to see this as a direct intervention by a Chola royal, by a Chola woman in the politics and devotion of a local temple. What is she doing? She is reorganizing the political economy through land purchases. She very often reorganizes the architectural concept of the temple by rebuilding it, and she had a trademark architectural style, mind you. Typically, she would have the god Nataraja depicted prominently on her temples, and she would rename parts of the locality after members of her family. So, I argue that what she's doing through this is she's presenting the Cholas not just as kings whose will is executed by a chain of loyal intermediaries, but as kings who are directly interested in devotion at a local level. And I think we live in times when it's quite evident, this link between politics and religion, but somehow we have been taught to imagine that this was not the case many centuries ago. I think the Cholas show us very clearly, especially the Chola women show us very clearly, that this is a very ancient link in Indian politics. And if we are to see clearly the way that our politics functions, we need to understand just how powerful and just how ancient the intermarriage of politics and religion and gender in the subcontinent is.
I think you used the.
Thank you.
You used the phrase political philanthropy at some point when you're talking about the donations that the Chola queens make to temples, and as a way of accruing political power. And it reminded me, because there are both similarities and differences in how the Mughal women behave in public in terms of political philanthropy. And another book that I've been reading recently is Jagjit Lalli's Badshah Bandar Bazaar, which is about the Mughal economy, and which he argues that the Mughal women are investing in sarais, in markets, in religious buildings, in trade, as a way of shoring up both religious and temporal merit, not just for themselves, but for the male contender for the throne that they may be supporting, and also possibly as an insurance in case that sort of male contender doesn't quite make it. So there is an investment in the self and in the political progress of the dynasty. And so now we are at a sort of crossroads. We could go into gender or we could go into power, but maybe let's do power, because that's what because we are talking about the building of power through the partly through the aid of the queens of the Chola dynasty. And here again, you began by talking about the Cholas as this great imperial force and how it is imagined in and has been imagined in nationalist discourse for, say, a century now. But power is not something that you get, you don't just wave your sword in the air and you have power. You don't just climb onto a horse and you have power. You don't just even decimate a population or conquer a rival kingdom and immediately gain power. Power is built over time, right? And what was very interesting for me was I saw in your book the Cholas doing things, trying out things that later on the Mughals possibly succeed at doing. So there is, you talk about the taking of taxes in cash, for example, right? And the issuing of coins in greater number. And in your reading, in fact, this is one of the reasons that the Chola Empire starts to totter. For the Mughals, they do exactly the same thing. Akbar starts taking revenue in cash. The land reforms of Akbar and Todarmal are, justifiably famous. And there is, to them, also a great deal of resistance. I mean, according to one account, there's in the span of Akbar's reign, there are 144 rebellions, not by the peasantry, but by the zamindars who are not interested in paying more taxes. You talk about the law. You talk about, there's a very interesting incident that I hope you'll elaborate on, of a fratricide in which the two brothers have a choice of which, what kind of forum to go to. And again, in Mughal times, you see this, and Jagjit Talli actually argues this very nicely in his book. You see the fact that there are many different legal forums that a person with a dispute can go to. But it is the state court official that becomes over time increasingly ubiquitous but also predictable, partly as a result, in fact, of the much maligned Aurangzeb's Fatwa-e-Alamgiri, which canonizes the law. And there are sort of four things. There's the third thing is the building of the emperor into a cult. You talk about this through the temple building, Brihadishwara. There's a way in which Raja is, there's a sleight of hand, the kind of pun on his name and the name of the god, which almost to suggest that Raja is the Lord himself. Very similar thing happens with Akbar, where he tries to turn Allah Akbar into a kind of greeting, but Allah Akbar of course means God, Allah is Akbar, great. But if you read it the way Akbar would like it to, it means Akbar is God. And finally, there is an ideology that emerges very clearly in the Mughal state during Akbar's time. You might say the idea of Sulh-e-Kul, or the peace for all, which comes to legitimize the state over a very, very long period of time. And now that is what was, for me, that was a question that I had for you. Does that ideology emerge in the Chola state? Is the importing of Nataraj as the Chola deity part of that ideology? So in a sort of four-part question, how do the Cholas and their queens build their power?
Okay, I think that by the time I answer the first part of this question, I'll probably forget what the fourth part was. But you've raised a bunch of really interesting ideas, which I'm just going to jump into in no particular order, Parvati. The first thing that strikes me is how humility seems to be an abiding feature of Indian politics. Like right from the Cholas all the way out to the present, and of course through Akbar himself, it seems that Indian politicians simply cannot resist naming things after themselves and comparing themselves in various ways to divinities great and small. But I'm particularly interested in this notion of the ruler as kind of deliberately blurring the lines between himself and divinity, because I think it was actually harder for Akbar to do it than it was for Raja Chola or really any early medieval king. Partly because at the time Shaivism, or particularly the Shaiva Siddhanta, had a pretty sophisticated apparatus essentially to transform mere mortals into something greater, right? The fundamental idea of Shaiva Siddhanta, and I don't know why I've gotten this. Okay, I'm committed to this. I'm just going to go through with it. Okay, it's going to get a bit philosophical, but I'm warning you guys right away. Right. So, the fundamental idea of Shaiva Siddhanta is that all of us have souls that are in some way equivalent to that of Shiva's soul. Right. So we are not equivalent to him, but our souls share the same nature as his soul. But we are held down to existence by fetters, which can only be loosened through Shiva's divine intervention. Now, one would imagine that a good way to do this would be through austerities and asceticism and so on and so forth. But the Shaiva Siddhantins had a slightly different idea. In fact, there's this fabulous set of agamas where they actually say that, oh, a king who builds a Meru-like great temple to Shiva will be freed from this mortal coil and will remain like Shiva after death, right? You can imagine why this was a brilliant theological innovation, because it allows kings to, rather than resorting to asceticism or trying to actually uplift the living conditions of subjects, simply build a ginormous temple, endow it with enormous amounts of wealth, and as a consequence be considered in a way almost as sharing the same nature as Shiva, right? So the temple known as the Brihadishwara today in Tanjavur was known in Chola times as the Raja Rajeshwaram, which means the home of Raja Raja's lord. But the Sanskrit compound word Raja Rajeshwara means Raja Raja's lord and also means Raja Raja as lord, right? There's this fascinating little discourse happening in Tamil Nadu today where almost every year, every other year, amateur archaeologists claim to have found the true tomb of Raja Raja Chola, the Samadhi of Raja Raja Chola. I don't think that such a structure actually exists, because once a king was cremated, his ashes would have been immersed in a river. And as far as Raja Raja Chola was concerned, when you look at the inscriptions of a temple like the Raja Rajeshwaram, not only do you see this centering of the king in all the temple rituals, in fact, you have some fabulous inscriptions where Raja Raja will say, on this day of this year of my reign, I was bathed in such and such hall of the palace, and the god Raja Rajeshwara was also bathed in such and such hall of the temple, and on that day, myself and my holy sister decided to give such and such gift to the temple. Or it would be something like, an army regiment would say that on this day when the king was bathed in this hall of the palace, we made this gift to the temple. So there's a very clear and deliberate attempt to create the temple almost as this nexus of military, of courtly, and of philanthropic networks, right? There's really no clear line between the church and the state as we would imagine it. And I don't think there's any contradiction, at least in the Indian mind, well into the time of Akbar. The very idea that a king is not a religious figure would have been rather alien to them. And I think that's also why I think increasingly over the last decade, Indian politics has taken a profoundly ritualistic turn. And I'm thinking of my home state, Telangana, where even non-Hindutva governments have taken great time and effort to expand and renovate pilgrimage sites, to improve pilgrim infrastructure. And they've gotten much better press for this than, for example, improving human development indicators, right? It's essentially a hack in Indian politics. There's been a long-running undercurrent. But the reason why I bring all this up, and the reason why I think it's important to talk about this in the context of the growth of Chola power, is because all of us are familiar with the ideas of the Cholas as this vast empire, right? So at the peak of the Chola expansion in the 11th century, the Chola influence extends for nearly 1,000 kilometers from north to south. How big of a bureaucracy do you guys think the Cholas had to run an empire of this scale? 10,000 people? 10,000? Reasonable guess? No? 50,000? 50,000 probably more reasonable. I see a few nodding heads. Yeah, 50,000 bureaucrats. It was 100 guys. Okay, so some 100 guys from the Kaveri area, the heartland of the Cholas, sitting in the Chola court, looking at revenue records from this enormous landmass with dozens of different ethnicities, cultures, and we're expected to believe that this was some kind of centralized state. Absolutely not. I think I worked myself up into drying out my throat. 1 second.
It was not a centralizing state, was it an amalgamating state?
Exactly. I think that's what really differentiates an early medieval from an early modern state, in that early modern states had gunpowder. You could point a gun at someone and say, pay your damn taxes. Okay? an early medieval king would have to send an army of like elephantry and cavalry to travel weeks and weeks to the farthest frontier.
Just to interject though, in the early modern, the pre-modern period, the Zamindar would also have a gun that he would point right back at you.
But the king would have a hell lot more guns than the Zamindar would. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that the communications infrastructure that the Mughals are working with, the specialization of the bureaucracy, particularly with Brahmin bureaucrats, with Baniya bureaucrats, was, I think, several orders of magnitude greater than what the Cholas could command, not necessarily for any other reason than simply over the course of 500 years, markets evolve, networks evolve, trade infrastructure evolves, therefore it is easier for a centralized state to exist, especially I think in the Gangetic plains where rivers act as this enormous capillary network really. Oh, how beautiful. A peacock just opened up its fan. Evidently a fan of centralization in early modern states. But the Cholas, I think it's important to understand that the Chola Empire for the longest time was really an affair of the Kaveri River Valley. Wherever the Cholas expanded, they made every effort to kind of pick up and transplant this Kaveri society, right? So in Sri Lanka, for example, in Polonnaruwa, they actually invite immigrants from the Kaveri to try and settle there. Similarly, in South Karnataka, not far from Bangalore, in this place called Kolar, once again, they actually renamed the town with a Tamil name, and they encouraged Tamil merchants and priests and so on to settle there. But ultimately, that doesn't work, because even if you have this little nucleus, that nucleus is weeks and weeks away from the imperial center. And so you have this very interesting situation that develops towards the late 11th century. Once the tide of conquest begins to slow, once you no longer have all this military loot pouring into the temple to project this larger than life image of the king, you see this amazing thing happening where village assemblies simply stop paying attention to the king. So they still preface their business by saying, oh, in XYZ year of XYZ king, we decided that we will pay this much taxes. I'm not sure if there's examples of Mughal subjects ever pulling off something that audacious successfully and living to tell the tale.
No, I know, because, and partly because of the, not necessarily because of the military power, but because a general argument would be because of the legitimacy that is created of the Mughal state. Not so for example, when you talk about law and you know, the sort of choose, not deference to, but choosing of the state appointed judge as the preferred judge in a situation where you could go to several, is a kind of legitimacy from below, you know, because the Mughal state will guarantee a certain access to speedy and predictable justice.
See, that's a great point, because we were talking about temple inscriptions earlier, how temple inscriptions project a particular image of what royal power looked like, right? Over the course of the 11th century, you have, you've all heard of the famous conqueror Rajendra Chola, right? So all of Rajendra Chola's sons take names that are variations of his, right? So his eldest son calls himself Vijaya Rajendra, his middle son calls himself Rajendra Deva II, and his youngest son calls himself Veera Rajendra, right? It's hard enough for me to keep track of them, living 1,000 years away. Imagine if you're somebody living in a little village in Tamil Nadu, okay? And even if the Chola state is successfully making inscriptions every year in your village and showing that they're interested, you go to your temple, you're like, oh, King Vijay Rajendra Deva conquered these towns. Okay, next year, King Rajendra II conquered these towns. And then King Veera Rajendra has conquered these towns. Sure, great, fantastic, great for the king. But what about my lands that are being gifted away to warlords? What about my relatives who have been sent away with the Chola armies to die on distant battlefields? What about my relatives who have been asked to uproot their lives and go and settle in this distant outpost? What to us might seem like evidence of an extraordinarily powerful and martial and expansionist empire that we should be proud of, to the average Chola subject must have seemed like a court that was much more interested in distant wars than in what's happening at the ground level, right? So that in itself, I think, is a point that's glaringly obvious once it's pointed out to us, but is completely missed out in this nationalist obsession with reading these as literal attestations of how glorious these pre-modern empires were, right? And this is exactly why in I think in 1060, 1054 something, this extraordinary incident that happens in northern part of present-day Tamil Nadu, when a peasant and his brother have an argument, which escalates quickly into blows, and the younger brother ends up killing the elder brother, right? Now, you would expect that, hey, this is the Chola heartland in the 11th century. Of course, these guys would go to a Chola judge to request justice, but they don't. Instead, they go to an assembly of landlords who come from the same caste. And these landlords say that in the year XYZ of the Chola king, we have decided that we will give this justice to these peasants. Why? I think that in itself raises the question of what was seen as a legitimate authority. This is not the king issuing a decree that, oh, local self-government and democracy and so on, as it is very often seen. It is instead an influential caste, an influential class and caste of landowners arrogating to themselves some of the functions of the state and stepping into a vacuum in state power. And the reason why I think this, you'll have to read the book to find out in a little more detail.
You have, in fact, one of the things that is happening alongside these kind of consolidations of local power is also the consolidations of caste. And that is one of the most fascinating parts of the book where, I mean, this is a sort of a little bit of a tangent, but certain castes are coming to groups of Brahmins and saying, give us a backstory.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. When I think about caste, I think that we tend to think of it as a
fixed and immutable.
as a fixed, immutable entity that was imposed from the top, right? So this was how it is decreed in the Manusmriti. Therefore, that's how it always worked throughout time. I think that this absolves an enormous chunk of middle India, I think especially the middle castes, from the role that they have played, not just in enforcing the system, but also profiting from it, right? And I say this as an OBC myself. It's something that I've seen happening within my own caste, is that as castes rise to political and economic power, invariably they tend to adopt behaviors that they see as more ritualistically pure. But in the process, they fix themselves in relation to the uppermost castes and, of course, the lowermost landless castes. This kind of assertion is happening all over the subcontinent. It's happening, especially in Tamil Nadu today, it's happening with castes that claim descent from Chola military units, as it happens. So, rather, like one would expect, the way that we think about caste, you would expect to see caste being most consolidated at a time of when the state is the most powerful. But the Chola inscriptions, and I'm using Chola purely as a chronological marker here, because a lot of these inscriptions are commissioned by people who are very far from the Chola court, show us very clearly that caste formation happens at times of political uncertainty. It is when there are opportunities for climbing the social ladder, as it were, that middle caste will take advantage of their socioeconomic position to trample weaker, especially landless castes, and of course exalt the ritual priestly caste at the very top. Any similarities to the present are completely coincidental.
Yeah, and this is happening at a time when Chola authority is weakening. So Chola power is having to negotiate with Brahmanical power and other kinds of power equations that are rising within the within this enlarging empire that is increasingly fractured.
Yeah.
It does not for somehow make alliances. Again, this was another sort of difference that seemed to me, like, you correct me, I mean, maybe we'll disagree on this, but that, you know, there are various neighboring empires that the Cholas march in and they defeat and they conquer. but rarely do these translate into alliances in the way that, particularly under Akbar, he is very good at at allying with the kings that he defeats. But that doesn't seem to happen with the Cholas.
I think this is why it's important to, as much as I'm not a fan of the great man theory of history, the fact is that some personalities and the institutions that they establish have a disproportionate impact on the way that their political edifices function, right? And I think Rajendra Chola, arguably much more than his father Rajaraja I, has an enormous impact on the way the Chola Empire ends up functioning, because early in his career, it seems that this famous conqueror actually tries to make alliances. So in roughly 1015, 1016, soon after he comes to the throne, Rajendra Chola actually promises the king of Sri Lanka that if you become my vassal, I will end hostilities with you, right? And then we have this extraordinary event that's described to us in Buddhist chronicles from the island, where they say that, oh, the Chola king promised this, and the Sri Lankan king gave up his regalia and bent the knee, and then the Chola imprisoned him. And I think that this happened not necessarily because Rajendra planned it that way, but because his other military campaigns against other rivals went much more successfully than he expected. So that very year, he actually happened to surprise the Cheras, who were the kings of Kerala, took one of their forts much more quickly than expected, and seized the Chera royal regalia. And then he seems to decide that, hey, why have allies when I can just make my sons puppet kings? And of course, he pays the price for this very, very dearly, because all of these sons are just as ambitious, just as cutthroat as any Mughal prince. And the rest, here's the amazing thing about Rajendra Chola, right? He comes to the throne in the year 1015. Up till the year 1026, he is doing just one campaign after another. So he's just doing these spectacular expeditions, like sending an army all the way to Bengal, and going and raiding Southeast Asia, all the things that we really celebrate him for today. Though why a democracy is celebrating warfare, don't ask me. But from 1026 onwards, at the very pinnacle of what we would think of as his career, this guy has just finished his raid of Southeast Asia, he stops conquering. He doesn't add any new conquests to these inscriptions that he's still commissioning. He seems to do nothing else militarily of note until his death. Instead, he leaves all the fighting of wars to his sons. And my God, those boys love fighting. Absolutely love fighting. But I think that none of them would find the ability to imagine, this audacious imagination of their father, until the last and youngest of them, Veera Rajendra, who made an attempt to build alliances, but in the process disinherited his nephew, and eventually that very same nephew would overthrow his son and take over the empire himself. So it didn't work out, ultimately. But again, I don't think that they lacked the ability to imagine alliances. It's just that the alliances the Cholas did were with internal groups rather than with external groups, right? So we were talking earlier about Sembian Mahadevi and her insistence on building all these temples. She was building these temples because she wanted to make alliances with villages, right? When you look at the inscriptions of Tamil Nadu in this period, it is not just the king has decreed this and therefore this is happening. Very often there's this amazing ability of locals to collectively negotiate with power. And the royal, quite counterintuitively, is very often forced to make accommodations to local politics rather than the other way around. Because this is this is a decentralized state, right? Which is why when the Cholas lose the ability to project power through financing temples, once again this instinct towards collective decision making reasserts itself, right? Which is why in the 12th century you see these unprecedented forms of inter-regional solidarity where caste groups from dozens, hundreds of miles away, and it might not seem a big deal to us, that's like a few hours drive today, right? In the medieval world, most people never left their village. Like mobility was quite alien to most people. So seeing solidarity, political solidarity across caste groups in the 12th century is extraordinary. And this is another one of my pet peeves, you know, like we go on and on about how India is the mother of democracy, right? And the example that is given of this is the Ganarajas of North India, these tribal oligarchies that were very, very far from democracies. And when we do talk about democracy in South India, we talk about like it was a gift that kings gave to the, how many kings can you guys name who voluntarily give up their power? How many autocrats voluntarily give up power? It's just not a thing. And it amazes me that the people of 800, 900 years ago were much more cynical about autocratic power and much more willing to build intercaste solidarities than the citizens of a 21st century democracy. It's just baffling to me. I mean, I don't want to over-romanticize what is happening, of course. There are caveats and so on and so forth. But I think it's important to remember that collective decision-making is as long of a tradition in India as bending the knee to the nexus of politics and religion. And in the 21st century, especially, I think it's time that we look back to lessons of solidarity from the past rather than lessons of autocracy.
Your sympathies.
Thank you.
Your sympathies are very clearly anti-autocrat in the book also, and I think one of perhaps my favorite chapter in the book is the second last one, where you talk about the people, and you managed to dig out a surprising amount of information about the kind of lives that ordinary people under the Cholas might have been living. And there were 2 or 3 things that were interesting to me, but I think we have limited time, so I will restrict myself to 2, and then we'll come to the women now, because we've talked about we've talked about the queens, but you write with great sympathy about the women in your book, but of the queens, of course, but even more so about the women who are part of what was called service retinues in service of the Chola kings. So that is one thing that I'd like to talk about. And the other thing that I would like to talk about, because this again in contrast with the Mughals, is that one of the things that's very interesting about the Mughal relationship with women is that it is not burdened with ideas of honor and shame that tend to, that these ideas of honor and shame are what women are invested in generally speaking, North Indian culture. I did not get the sense, this is not to say that there's no exploitation of women, or oppression of women, or, that it's some kind of beautiful utopian world, but I did not get the sense of women being, made to carry the honor of a clan or the honor of a man on their shoulders in Chola times either.
Well, just to explain why my sympathies don't lie with autocrats, there's only so many inscriptions you can read about a king burning down cities and despoiling his enemies' women and stealing his animals and this and that before you begin to get a little fed up with what untrammeled military power can do. And I'm really not ashamed to admit. I think it's very interesting that this idea of political objectivity is very often claimed primarily by the right wing, who are notorious, I think, or let's say famous for their nuanced reading of historical facts. So I think that historians should be allowed to have opinions, and I
fully agree with that. I think they should not be allowed to. They should. It's one of the duties of a historian to have an opinion, and it is a fundamentally human impulse to have a bias. So the idea of bias as being some kind of original sin in the writing of history is, to me, a complete red herring. So to have opinions is not only a good thing, but it's an imperative almost.
Yeah, and an opinion is just that. It is an opinion, and you are, of course, all welcome in the Q&A to interrogate me and drag me over the coals if you disagree with my opinions. Now, what was the question again?
The question was, tell me your opinion about the service retinue.
Yes. So here's the thing, right? Sorry, I think I cut you off there, but I just had this how many of you guys have seen Ponniyin Selvan? Ponniyin Selvan? Yeah, a good number of people. So Ponniyin Selvan also features Sembiyan Mahadevi, the Chola queen who we just talked about, Does anybody remember how Ponniyin Selvan presents Sembiyan Mahadevi? No? No? There's like one scene where she shows up only because the people of Tanjavur are praising her, like, oh wow, the queen, how generous of her to keep cold water available for the subjects, you know. Which is, I think, such an injustice to this remarkable lady, but also speaks to the way that powerful early medieval women especially are imagined, right? They're just reduced to these pious widows or to these vessels for the pride and honor of Hindu civilization who are despoiled by invaders, which I think is a profound injustice to the way these women were educated, the way they presented themselves, because they were very political and very proud of their aristocratic descent. They did not present themselves really as feminist figures. In fact, they operated very much within patriarchal systems, and that's something that they understood. There's a reason why Sembiyan Mahadevi in her inscriptions is presenting herself as the wife and the mother of kings rather than as an autonomous agent in her own right? That was the nature of the times. But this focus on powerful women in patriarchal systems, I think, inevitably ends up burying women who did not have that kind of agency, because they didn't come from those kinds of family backgrounds. They didn't have the wealth required to navigate these kinds of systems. And the perfect example of this are the women of the Chola service retinues. Now, when you think about medieval warfare, right, there's this notion that these were peaceful conquests. Absolutely not. Even contemporary armies, even 21st century United Nations peacekeeping forces have been accused of being undisciplined and especially of sexual exploitation of the women they're supposed to be protecting. Yet we're meant to believe that a decentralized early medieval army with widely varying degrees of professionalism, varying qualities of recruitment, which are essentially, you know, military entrepreneurs or signing up seasonally for campaigns, we're expected to believe that these were somehow chivalrous bodies. Unfortunately, they were not. And when you look at the Chola inscriptions, the Cholas are actually, and not to single out the Cholas for this, all early medieval kings do this. They spend a lot of time describing how they captured their enemies' women. And the Cholas were only somewhat exceptional in that the court had an organized institution to receive all these captured women, and quite a lot of Chola inscriptions and court literature actually talks about this service retinue. And the service retinue was highly ritualized in that you attack the Pandya king, you capture the women of his court, and
including the queens.
Including the queens. And you organize them into something called a service retinue. And very often the service retinue would bear the name of the king that established it. So stuff like the Raja select Pandya service retinue of the sacred bath. So the women of the Pandya country ritually bathe the Chola king, infusing him with power in a sense. And it seems, I mean, it is an uncomfortable situation to imagine. But very often these ladies would also be serving the very same queens who we celebrate today as empowered by the Chola kings, right? And there is really no way to resolve this contradiction. It's important to point it out, and I think pointing it also better helps us understand how women continue to negotiate patriarchy. And I'm wondering, Parvati, if there's parallels to this in the way that the Mughal court also functioned, where, of course, you have the Nur Jahan, but are there also captured women in the harem?
There are captured women in Babur's own family. Very famously, his sister, Khanzada Begum, has to be given up to Shaibani Khan, the Uzbek, who basically defeats Babur's dreams of conquering Samarkand. And then when Shaibani Khan loses Samarkand and his head, Khanzada comes back to Babur. And what is most interesting about all this is that she comes back without any shame or dishonor, and, you know, comes to a very highly respected, occupies a very highly respected position in the court of the, in his court and in the court of his son Humayun. She's a diplomat, ambassador, power broker, advisor. You know, she plays a very strong political role, and which is why, before I think we are going to go to Q&A in a second, which is why I wanted to ask, because, these women are being captured by rival kings and put into service retinues to, do whatever they do.
Yes.
But there is also, at the same time, it is not as if they are being killed beforehand. A system of Johar, for example, does not exist. It's not like the Pandya. If the Chola army comes marching in, the Pandyas are not murdering their own women in order to protect the honor of the the Pandyan lord or the Pandyan king. So in a systemic way, it felt to me, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, that there is not that kind of investment of shame and honor in women, which kind of parallels the the Mughal sense of women also, because they don't understand Johar. There's no it's not that women. Some of that starts creeping in, but that's a long, complicated story that I won't get into. But it's a very different understanding of relationships between men and women that exists.
Well,
in the
I would say
world.
yes and no, because men, of course, seem to think of these women as treasures, right? Which is why it's so important to capture them. And when you look at but these women don't seem to have thought of themselves as shamed or lacking agency anyway, because you see them forming relationships with the Chola court. And some of these women actually rose to positions of considerable influence as the favorites of kings, as the attendants of up, then I'll come back. I'll come back to this idea. Oh yes, we're back. We're back. Thank you. Thank you. I still forgot my train of thought though, so we're not really any better off than where we were. But since we have limited time, why don't we take some questions and maybe I'll come back to this in a little time. Can we? Yes, gentleman up front.
Thank you. So I've read all your books, and I have a very candid question. In my very limited reading in Indian authors, I see Anirudh talking about the Cholas in a very specific way, and some other authors talking about Cholas in a very different way, very popular authors. You tend to ground them in reality, and you tend to talk about sources and stuff, whereas the other authors talk about Cholas as the way they talk about them.
Surgical strike on Ghazni, man.
So as a person who reads books and who loves history, I am absolutely confused. And I'm trying to ask you if it frustrates you or what's your opinion on the overall picture. Thank you.
Great question. As you may have guessed, it is very annoying. But hey, I didn't begin reading history through hardcore nonfiction. Like, to me, my interest in history began through video games. It began through historical fiction, especially Con Eagleton's series on Genghis Khan. And of course, this incredible Australian author who wrote this entire series on Caesar, whose name I forget, but fantastic series. But my point is that as much as it might be annoying to me personally, I think it's important also to understand that people find and learn history over the course of years and decades and through passion and exploration. And who's to say that these authors aren't creating audiences for books like mine, just as reading historical fiction about Julius Caesar led me to read Adrian Goldsworthy and become like a Roman history nerd when I was in college. I think it's important to, as disturbing as some of the political implications of this are in the immediate present, history is never over. Historical opinions will keep forming, changing, and inevitably simplistic opinions give way to complex truths. So That's the way I like to see it. But great question. A gentleman here.
I think in the explanation of the part where we were talking about women and their status and stature in the Chola Empire, the way you spoke about it, there was one description wherein you said that women, of course, were seen by certain kings, and I think Parvati also was making a kind of interaction there by saying as treasure by these kings in what happened to be the victor's narrative or otherwise as such. But you also mentioned how these women certainly might not have the same ambition of thinking about themselves in the same nerve, because of course they were handling a lot of interventions at the court as such. But wouldn't that be to discount, or maybe not say discount, but wouldn't that not be to overlook the power relationship or the power dichotomy between the forces and the women? What reasons inspire your thought that way? Would you want to put some light on it? What exactly were the historical reasons for that formulation?
Well, I'm very much open to the imbalance and the violence involved in that power dynamic. In fact, we have some. There's a very famous Chola court text called the Kalingatta Parani, which was written to praise a campaign into present-day Odisha. And it begins with an exhortation to the captured ladies of the court to open up their doors to the returning victorious army. And you can imagine that whether the women wanted to open these doors or not, they would be opened, right? So that's something I'm acutely aware of. But at the same time, I think it's important not to strip these women of their agency. Like this idea that the women are treasures to be captured is what literate and powerful men are saying about them. But in inscriptions and temple gifts that these women are making, they are not saying that I was captured from such and such place by such and such king. They're saying that I am a member of such and such service retinue in the court. I am making this gift for the merit of myself and my children. And very often these children, keep in mind, would have been the products of sexual violence. Yet these women clearly see them as part of their familial network. And they're using these children as, or at least they're presenting these children as ways for them to accrue religious merit, very much in the same way that a Chola queen would present her sons and her daughters, right? Which is, again, while it's not exactly an example of, while they're not exactly free agents in doing this, they still do have some kind of agency. They are not simply victims. I think that's just as unfair to reduce Chola queens to pious mothers and devout wives. It's also unfair to reduce trafficked women simply to victims of violence at the hands of men. These are women who sought in various ways to participate in politics, who sought to be remembered and did not take what had been done to them lightly. They didn't just disappear into the historical record, if that makes sense. Yes, sir.
Hello, Anirudh. My question actually doesn't have to do much with religious themes, but this is a personal observation I've made by looking at many South Indian temples. Is that in the earlier examples of Dravidian architecture in 8th to 11th century, the Vimana or the point above the Garbhagriha tends to be the most tallest part of the whole temple structure. But later, as we go on, we see the Meenakshi temple or the Ramnath Swami in Srirangam, the Gopuram tends to be the tallest part of the whole temple complex. And what is this a true pattern or just observation I made, or does it have to do something with the later patrons or kings enlarging that temple complex? What do you think?
You've nailed it. That's exactly what's happening. That very often when and this I think is actually one of the most enduring patterns that Cholas set up. Right, there's so many things that the Cholas do that outlive them, that I think aren't really talked about enough in our focus on these what were actually very ephemeral conquests that were limited to their time. One of the really big changes that happens in the 12th and 13th centuries as the Chola state is beginning to decline is that local aristocrats, warlords, landlords seek to make their mark on local temples just as Chola kings once did. And the way they do this is by expanding the temple because it's already been renovated by the Chola king. Now you can just like tack on new structures to it. So you build a mandapa, for example. Or depending on your resources, you'll build a towering, impressive gateway. And as architectural technology develops further in South India, you begin to have these absolutely absurdly tall temple spires that are built. So, of course, Srirangam is a fabulous example. The Madurai Meenakshi is a great example. Now, a lot of these temples, the most impressive gopurams actually date to the 17th century, right? So, they're actually contemporaries of like the Sistine Chapel. This is something I find very funny is that they're taught, when you search for ancient South Indian temple, you get like a 17th century gopuram, which is like pretty recent as far as South Indian temple architecture goes. But great observation. You're absolutely right in your diagnosis of what is happening as well.
Temple is usually like made by the Cholas, but the gopuram we actually see are made by like some Nayakas.
Vijayanagara
like
Nayakas, especially
yeah.
the Nayakas in Tamil Nadu. You've done your reading, well done. The gentleman here, the striped shirt.
Hi. In your books, you talk about how kings of the south, particularly Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, when they go on about setting up an empire, they would invite, priests, Brahmins from the north for, yajnas or granting of land, settle them there. So I had two questions. One was the mechanics of it, as in why was it so expensive to bring Brahmins or Vedic priests, and whose land was being distributed? Was it royal land, and what do the Brahmins do with the land once they settle it? And second was why, as in how come it became the first thought for a king of the south to do that? Was it because they thought that this is the right thing to do, or was it like an aura? Like since you mentioned that you were a classical Rome nerd, so like how the Romans felt about the Greeks, that they adopted the Greek thought even though they were not sure how alien was it, so they wanted to get into that Hellenic universe. So was it the same way that the kings of the south felt that there is more legitimacy in the Sanskritic universe of the north, so we will adopt it even though we feel that it is alien? Or was it was already a part of that Sanskritic universe, it's just that a new empire is being built, so the right thing to do is to have a Rajasuya or something, Ashwamedha, and establish your credibility?
You actually answered your question yourself. Well done, sir. So yes, that is kind of what is happening in that, especially from the 5th century onwards, Brahmins in the Gangetic plains developed this package of offerings that can easily be picked up and transplanted into different political contexts, right, to legitimize emerging kings. So it's partly the ritual aspect of it, and that these are very spectacular rituals which demonstrate the king's might to potential subjects, rivals, etc., etc. Brahmins have also developed a particular mode of presenting royal power in Sanskrit that's legible to literati across an enormous landmass. And they've also, by virtue of their connection to courts, developed skills that are very useful to kings. I'm not just talking about rituals here, but especially for the Cholas, you see there's quite a lot of Brahmin generals and quite a lot of Brahmin bureaucrats who were closely tied to the state and sometimes served Chola emperors across 2 or 3 generations, like the same family of Brahmins. So it's a bunch of different things that are happening. And as for what land was being given to the Brahmins, the Cholas give us the clearest example. Very often it was land that was owned by somebody else. Sometimes it would be purchased, sometimes the purchases would happen voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. But enormous blocks of land would be given to these Brahmins, and then they would essentially become a class of zamindars, right? Today, the word Brahmin, and this is, I think, primarily a result of the British interacting with priestly Brahmins and then using them as their interlocutors to understand what Brahmins had been throughout time. We think of Brahmins primarily as priests. But to the average medieval person, a Brahmin was a landed courtly aristocrat. And that's very much the picture that emerges from the Chola inscriptions. They were a class of landed zamindars who had substantial concessions given to them by kings in return for services performed to the state, both symbolically but also in very real and practical terms. And they essentially cornered for themselves very lucrative courtly opportunities that lasted, and that the grip that Brahmins had, especially on the organs of the Chola state, would only begin to fade in the 12th and 13th century when a new class of warlords, primarily from cultivating but also military backgrounds, would really would break the state itself. So, great question. You've done your reading. Well done. What a great audience, actually. You guys are really well read. It's fabulous to be talking about these kind of technicalities of Southern history right here in the middle of Delhi in this beautiful Sunder Nursery.
Well, on the subject of Brahmins, I can just add one thing, that Jahangir does a brief ethnography of the castes of India in the Jahangir Nama, and he describes the Brahmins. He says the job of the Brahmin is to receive gifts. So that sums up all of it. But I think, do we have time for one last question? Or are we? Oh, there is one lady with the hand up there.
So, Anirudh, I had two observations and two questions. You mentioned historical fiction, and I was interested in how you see Kalki. And I was thinking of this because, I come from Gujarat, and when I used to talk about K.M. Munshi, whose historical fiction actually created, engendered for the people of Gujarat a very definite sense of who the Chalukyas were and what they are supposed to have done, and even how the arrival of Muslims brought an end to this golden period and what have you, the edifice on which the Asmita of Gujarat comes to be built. And in that process, I realized that Kalki was also a very interesting sort of a figure but he didn't come up when you were talking about him. So I was interested in knowing how you think of historical fiction. And I also found it fascinating when you began your talk and you said something about how one wouldn't have thought that these temples were the sites of power. And once again, of my reading of this period in Gujarat, I know that ecclesiastical power of the Jains and the fact that they are Baniyas and the fact that they know statecraft, all of that actually combined to create a particular kind of power in Western India, right? And but from our vantage point, the subtitle of this talk says what it is to look at the past from the present. From our standpoint, both of you are right when you said that caste has a certain fixity. Not only that, we think there is a fixity also around what is sacred and what is secular. Like we don't sort of understand that there is. I was interested in knowing from both of you whether you think these distinctions have come to be created through modernity or through a certain colonialist way of like separating dharm and jati and dharm and secular and what have you. I think basically I'm pushing you to think a little, to talk to us a little about the revision of categories that takes place when we go to the past.
Fabulous questions, ma'am. Absolutely. I think Kalki and Ponniyin Selvan particularly play a enormous role in how the Cholas are imagined today. There's this fabulous interview that Kalki's granddaughter and translator gave, where she talked about why Kalki wrote about the Cholas the way that he did. We have to remember that Kalki was active in the 1950s, which is the time when anti-Hindi agitations were kicking off in the deep south, and there was a genuine feeling, especially among freedom fighters like Kalki, that Tamil identity was being given short shrift in national politics. So what Kalki did is, when he's writing Rajaraja Chola, he's taking what he perceives as the qualities of the great figures of the freedom struggle and distilling them into this singular character. So I actually have this quote right in the introduction where he imagined Rajaraja as having the steel of Patel and the erudition of Nehru and the honesty and simplicity of Gandhi, or something on those lines. Now, whether those are real or imagined qualities is a whole other matter for another day. But my point is that Kalki himself was very clear. If you read Ponniyin Selvan, he actually repeatedly stops the narrative to exhort the young Tamil reader to be proud of their ancestors. Now, that is great for the 1950s. I understand the political context in which that idea develops. But then, in the decades after, when Dravidian nationalism kicks off, increasingly this romanticized idea of the Cholas becomes almost this totemic expression of the greatness of Tamil civilization, right? Which is an interesting cultural phenomenon in itself, but it is not historical, right? In fact, there's quite a lot of Wikipedia pages on various Chola figures with biographies that are pulled directly from Ponniyin Selvan. Like even today, that's still a thing. Now, I found this, I think the recent discourse around the Cholas really fascinating, because first you had this resurrection of Ponniyin Selvan by Mr. Mani Ratnam, turning them into this blockbuster Tanishq-wearing dynasty hanging out in Gwalior Fort, right? And then the next year, you have a concerted attempt by the Prime Minister. You have him taking the Sengol supposedly belonging to the Chola, royal scepter, using a royal scepter to inaugurate parliament, right? Then the year after that, the Prime Minister goes down to Tamil Nadu to celebrate the 1000th year anniversary of the Chola raid in Southeast Asia, which once again, that's what we should be celebrating, war, yeah. And you have a series of religious leaders, I mean, religious probably might be generous, but self-declared spiritual leaders claiming to have various Chola artifacts, including a certain gentleman who claims to have the fragments of the Somnath temple that were shattered by Mahmud of Ghazni, which he doesn't have that, he's just making stuff up. And you also have a best-selling author of quote-unquote historical fiction, sorry my friend, claiming that the Cholas put together a team of avengers to avenge the humiliation of Somnath by doing a surgical strike on Ghazni, right? So I found this entire arc really very interesting, and in fact I was I actually realized so I was making fun of this whole process on one fine evening on my Instagram, and later that evening I saw the Ministry of Culture had sent me a message, and I was like, oh no, I'm going to be in trouble now. But it turns out they actually wanted me to cover the Prime Minister's visit to Gangaikonda Cholapuram as an influencer, which I'm not sure if I should take as a compliment or not. But yes, there is a very, very clear. To your second question about the overlapping of dharam, jati, political, ecclesiastic power, absolutely, I think that the Cholas and the epigraphic corpus left behind by the Cholas allows us to see this in incredible detail, like a level of detail that I think is just not visible for the Chalukyas, for example. You can very clearly trace out the push and pull between all of these factors. So it's the Hindutva view of this is that all these different aspects of pre-modern society were in complete concert to create this ideal golden age. But that's not really what the primary sources suggest at all. They suggest that even at the peak of what you might call a Hindu golden age, these are contested. These are complex dynamics where no single stakeholder is entirely in concert about what the other stakeholders' position in all this should be. And I think that kind of dynamism is very often missing from our imagination of the medieval past. these are not, I mean, the term medieval is so interesting to me because especially on Twitter, medieval is used almost as an insult. It's like, oh, your attitude is so medieval. But medieval people were dynamic, they were intelligent, they argued, they fought, they debated, they pushed against royal power and sometimes and contingently and carefully accepted in some cases. And that, I think, is a much more optimistic takeaway for how Indians have thought about religion and politics than the staid image that is typically presented to us of how our past operated. So, thank you for allowing me to go on this little rant.
Well, that's a good note to end on.
Yes,
also.
thank you all. You've been such a
Thank
great
you all
audience.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anirudh.
Thank you, Anirudh. Thank you, Parvati, for a riveting conversation. Thank you all for being a wonderful audience. We have books, and we have both of them. So if you want to pick up a book, get it signed, most welcome. And thank you so much.